Welcome to the first session of Opening the Schoolhouse to All. I'm Lynn Carrillo, Chair of the Enoch Turner Schoolhouse Foundation. The Foundation's mission is to share the story of the struggle for equal access to public education. In this series, we hope to explore how access to public education has expanded and the barriers that remain. The second session in the series takes place on November 24th and then resumes on January 12th and ends January 19th. Registration is open. This evening, we present The Promise of Equity, Race, Multiculturalism, and Indigenous Education, chaired by Funké Aledejebi, Assistant Professor in the Department of History at the University of Toronto. Professor Aledejebi studies 20th century history, specializing in Black Canadian history. Her forthcoming book, Schooling the System, A History of Black Women Teachers, explores the importance of Black Canadian women in sustaining their communities and preserving a distinct Black identity. Funké will introduce the panel.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Lynn. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our session on the promise of equity. I feel really honored to be chairing tonight's panel of critical and engaging scholars who are pushing the boundaries of the ways in which we talk and discuss inclusion and access to education in Canada. And so in order to give more space for our discussion tonight, I will introduce our four panel speakers who will then deliver their brief presentations, and then we will open the discussion session for questions. Our first speaker today is Natasha Henry. Natasha Henry is completing her PhD in history at York University, researching the enslavement of Africans in early Ontario, for which she received a 2018 Vanier Scholarship. She is also the president of the Ontario Black History Society. And as a historian and for the past 21 years, an educator, Natasha has won awards for her writing and curriculum development, focusing on Black Canadian experiences. Natasha's topic is titled, All I Want is Justice and I Will Be Satisfied. Black Communities Challenge Racially Segregated Public Education. She will begin by speaking to the historical moment that frames tonight's discussion, and then we will center that conversation around the closing of the last segregated school in Ontario. Our second speaker, Rob Vipond, is a professor of political science at the University of Toronto and the author of the book, Making a Global City, How One Toronto School Embraced Diversity, describing the Clinton Street Public School. The book won the 2018 Brant Award for the Ontario Historical Society for the best book on multicultural history in Ontario. Professor Vipond discovered this interest in the history of education when his daughter's principal invited him to join the school's 125th anniversary celebration committee. This chance encounter led him to the thousands of student registration cards that underpin his book. Professor Vipond's topic is titled, Multiculturalism and Anti-Racism, Are They Compatible? Our third speaker tonight is Carl James. Professor James holds the Jean Augustine Chair in Education, Community, and Diaspora in the Faculty of Education at York University, where he is also the Senior Advisor on Equity and Representation. He teaches in the Faculty of Education and in the graduate programs in sociology and social and political thought. His research interests include the schooling experiences, educational performances, employment opportunities, career trajectories, and social achievements of racialized peoples, particularly Black youth. Professor James' topic today is titled, Multiculturalism Elides Race and Hinders Equity in Education. How relevant is the promise? Our final speaker is Ian Mosby. And Ian Mosby is an assistant professor in the Department of History at Ryerson University. His work explores the history of food, Indigenous health, and the politics of settler colonialism. His publications include the book Uncertain Harvest, The Future of Food on a Warming Planet with Sarah Rotz and Evan Fraser, as well as the award-winning book Food Will Win the War, The Politics of Culture and Science of Food on Canada's Home Front. Professor Mosby's topic tonight is titled Learning the Truth About Reconciliation, the TRC, History and the Future of Indigenous Education. So without further ado, I'm really looking forward to hearing about tonight's discussion, and I will welcome Natasha Henry to take the floor.
Thank you, Funké. Good night, everyone. It's great to be here this evening. Just 1 second. So I'm going to open up with the historical moment for this evening. If everyone can just make sure that they're muted, please, and thank you. So our historical moment brings us to looking at the last racially segregated school in Ontario, which closed in 1965. Leonard Braithwaite was born on October 23rd, 1923. He graduated from Osgoode Hall Law School, in 1958, and started his law practice in Etobicoke. In September of 1963, he ran as a Liberal MPP and won, making him the first Black Canadian elected to a provincial legislature. On February 4th, 1964, Braithwaite gave his first speech before the Ontario legislature, speaking against the Separate Schools Act, which allowed for racial segregation in Ontario schools. 1 month later, a bill was introduced that changed that act, which finally resulted in the closure of the last racially segregated school in Ontario, School Section Number 11, or SS Number 11, in Colchester South, which is approximately 42 kilometers south of Windsor, along the shores of Lake Erie. The school was a one-room schoolhouse. There was no indoor plumbing, and the heat came from a coal-fired furnace that belched smoke. SS Number 11 had its own board of trustees from the local Black community. In the 1950s, one of the pushes to integrate the new local elementary school was because this SS Number 11's well, the community well which it drew from, was contaminated. SS Number 11 trustees and parents heard that the Essex County School Board was planning to close most of the one-room schoolhouses and divert those students to the large new elementary school, but not the SS Number 11, which had all Black students. And so they suspected that the white trustees of the county were planning to leave SS Number 11 out of these new changes. This came to the attention of the media, and so a conversation ensued. Some members of the local Black community got together with George and Alvin McCurdy of Amherstburg to form an advocacy group called the South Essex Colored Citizens Association. The group lobbied to have SS Number 11 closed and the students sent to the new integrated elementary school. By then, the majority of local Black communities had come to support integration, and a large part of that as well was because of the infrastructure, the poor infrastructure that they were facing in the one-room schoolhouses. And in 1965, SS Number 11 finally closed. In this moment, let us remember the persistence of the Black parents and of Colchester South, and the actions of Leonard Braithwaite in closing the last racially segregated school in Ontario. So this is a great segue into my presentation, and I will speak a little bit elaborating on racially segregated schools in Ontario and the advocacy of ongoing advocacy of Black parents and Black communities in addressing racial inequities. My talk is taken from a letter community petition written in 1843 by the colored people of Hamilton, as it notes. In this letter, which is the document from the Archives of Ontario, and in 1843, community members came together to draft this letter talking about the situation where they were paying their taxes but being denied access to public schools. They talked about being verbally assaulted in the streets, being called the N-word, and that in their advocacy for trying to get entrance to the local public schools, that they were facing challenges because of racism. They wrote this letter, which was directed to the Governor General, Sir Charles Metcalfe. Metcalfe asked Assistant Superintendent of Education to intervene. And schools would eventually become desegregated in Hamilton. However, Black students were desegregated in the sense that they could enter the school building, but Black children were still required to sit on separate benches in many of Hamilton's common schools. And it's important to note that white opposition to integration remained strong, not only in Hamilton, but in other places in the province. The year previously, this map was issued. This is a district map of Colchester and Essex County, the school district. And we will see here SS number 6, clearly identified as the Negro school. And to contextualize this, a mere 6 years prior to that, the Abolition Act passed, abolishing enslavement in most British colonies. And that led to Canada being a place of reception for freedom seekers from the United States, and led to an increase in the Black population in places, particularly along river crossings and border crossings. And so Colchester is just across the ways from the United States. And so we see with this map, what we are able to capture and see is that the prevailing ideas of Black people that undergirded enslavement did not disappear in 1834. And despite the legal prohibition against discrimination in education, that we see that many white Ontarians opposed the settlement of Black people in or near their communities and refused them entrance to the common, or what we call public schools. And so I'll just briefly share with you some examples of racially segregated schools across the province of Southwestern Ontario. Here is an excerpt from a note that summarized a dispute and conversation taking place in Amherstburg in 1846, where white school trustees and parents were vehemently opposed to Black children attending the local common schools and refused them admission. And so we see here that the expression of wanting to cut off their children's head rather to have their children attend schools with Black children is something that a message that was conveyed in different wording, different phrasing across Southwestern Ontario. Schools in Amherstburg would remain rate segregated. This is one of the segregated schools in Amherstburg, the King Street School, which remained a desegregated school until about 1910. In London, Ontario in 1847, we see here again an example of Black parents talking about paying taxes, paying into the coffers of public education, but not reaping the benefits for it from their children being denied access. And in this communication, it's noted that when Black parents bring their children to the schools to gain entry, that the white children are withdrawn by their parents, and the teachers are painfully obliged to decline admission to Black children. And so here we see that, this letter says that they wind up yielding to an injustice which they are too weak to address because their strength in keeping the children out. So this practice formed in the 1840s, and it's duplicated, it's replicated in different places. And the practice became quite common, so much so that when the Common Schools Act was revised in 1890, and there was a clause put in there, the Separate Schools Act, the clause was put in to allow communities, particularly Catholic and Black families, if they so choose, to start their own common schools. However, what wound up happening was because this practice was so prevalent that white dominant school boards, the trustees would enact this clause and then force the creation of racially segregated schools and force Black families to attend that school wherever they lived in that jurisdiction. And this is the act that Mr. Braithwaite put in to have revoked from the act. So we see with I just quick mention here that with the Common Schools Act, we see that when the practice became quite prevalent, that education leadership conceded to the racist views and the racist practices. Egerton Ryerson, who became the chief superintendent of education in the province, he held this position for 32 years. Under his leadership, racially segregated schools became common, and at one point he did note that he felt that the sentiment was so strong that there was not much that he could do. Racially segregated schools continued into the 20th century. Here we see a very vivid image here again in Colchester in 1888, where we see Black children set aside from the white children, the majority of the student body. And when you take a look at this picture, we can only imagine the climate that Black children had to endure, the emotional and the mental trauma as it relates to pursuing their education in the public system. Black parents did look for other alternatives, and there were different groups who sought to provide alternatives to Black families. One example was the Colored Mission in Windsor, formed in 1890s by Reverend Ragnar here on the very left, and he invited nuns from Quebec to come and operate the mission, which included teaching, and they agreed to come if they could open up a hospital, which would become the first hospital in Windsor. But here we see in the quote taken from the records regarding the schools that, again, a sentiment that, that many white teachers held at the time. They said that the boys who are the rejects of the other children of their race seem to only have an interest for wrongdoing and disobedience. The girls, according to our parents, are not worth much more. These ideas of that came through in this report speaks to at this particular time period the growing ideology of scientific racism, which purported racial inferiority of Black people, and this was included in public education in Canada. So segregated schools looked differently in different places. It could be separate buildings. It could be relegation to separate benches. Black students in racially segregated schools were taught primarily by Black teachers. It's something that Funké talks about in her research and in her new book. And these teachers were able to produce great results in underfunded and undersourced schools. In Toronto, schools were integrated, but had no Black teachers until 1952. And so Black parent advocacy included a number of exercises, and they responded on a regular basis to racial segregation in public education. Many parents preferred separate schools, while others pushed for integration. So there's also this conversation in the community about, the kind of environment that would be ideal for Black children to thrive. Some Black parents refused to send their children to segregated schools. There were alternative created learning spaces that were created, including Sunday schools, mission schools, and private schools like those started by Mary Bibb and Mary Ann Shadd Carey. Parents led direct action, such as in Chatham. And in Chatham in 1890s, in 1891, what they decided to do on August 1st, Emancipation Day, instead of marching in the streets in celebration, they used the event to kick off a campaign to protest segregated schools and to push for desegregation. Black parents also took their fights to the courts, suing school trustees and school boards in their efforts to have common schools desegregated and for Black separate schools to receive equal funding. Between 1850 and 1885, there were at least 6 lawsuits that were launched by Black parents, and in all but one case, the practice of excluding Black children from public schools was upheld by the upper courts. The court rulings in favor of only one Black family is demonstrative of how entrenched and acceptable racism was and is in education. So these historical patterns of anti-Black racism and marginalization existed in colonial public education in Ontario, which were supported by the laws and the courts and sought to maintain and reinforce white supremacist ideologies and practices. And the result was limited educational opportunities or no education at all for some Black children in some communities, not to mention the irreparable psychological and emotional damage they endured, the indignities they suffered, and the traumas that they faced. And there are many manifestations of that today. There's the persistent anti-Black views held of Black students and Black parents. There's the realities of streaming of Black children. They are underrepresented in some programs such as gifted programs and specialty and specialized programs, and the disproportionate outcomes that they face historically continuing through to today. There's 180 years of systemic racism in education in Ontario, including racially segregated schools, and as I mentioned, the disproportionate outcomes. And so, we do need to face the reality, and there's a lot of conversation, that anti-Blackness is entrenched in public education. And as such, there is an educational debt owed to Black children and Black families for historic and ongoing racial inequities. Black parents today continue this tradition of advocacy in Toronto, in Peel, in Durham, in Ottawa, in York Region, and in many other places, calling for justice that remains elusive. And it brings me back to the quote from that 1843 letter: "All I want is justice, and I will be satisfied." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natasha. And we will quickly move on to our next speaker, Professor Vipond.
Hello and thank you. I've given my presentation this evening the title Multiculturalism and Anti-Racism. Are they compatible? Because of the 3 themes this evening, multiculturalism, race, and indigeneity, my theme, I think, might seem a little bit old-fashioned and out of step for a topic like equity, a bit like those family relatives who insist on reminiscing about the good old days rather than living in the present. By that, I mean that the conversation about equity in Canada, in education, but also more broadly, has come increasingly to center on race and indigeneity, not multiculturalism. From where I sit, I don't hear many people arguing that the best way to achieve equity in education is to double down on the promise of multiculturalism. If anything, I hear the opposite, that multiculturalism is in some way a hindrance to equity, especially in matters of race and indigeneity. So I want to complicate the story a little bit, I think, and in so doing suggest some ways in which multiculturalism speaks to and about equity. As someone who has spent a lot of time trying to understand the history of multiculturalism and education in Ontario, what I want to suggest is that in the 1980s, when multiculturalism was hot and new, and anti-racism, the two went hand in hand. They were allies in the same fight, which was framed precisely as a fight for equity. And I want to suggest, at least tentatively, that maybe there is something worth recovering from that earlier alliance. To get there, with your indulgence, I want to loop back to my book, Making a Global City. The book takes its bearings from the history of a downtown Toronto school, Clinton Street Public School, which is in Little Italy. I became interested in it because I was intrigued to understand how a school, which first opened its doors in 1888, had changed over the years. I knew that, at its origins, Clinton's families were largely Anglo-Irish. And I knew that from the end of the First World War onwards, Clinton, like other downtown schools, had served as a gateway for a series of immigrant communities, especially Eastern European Jews in the 20s and 30s, Italians and Portuguese in the 50s and 60s, and then a kaleidoscopic multicultural mix in the 70s and 80s. As I learned more about the school, what I came to realize is that each of the eras in the school's life was a sort of microcosm of larger changes that were occurring in Canadian society, especially with respect to the definition and meaning of what I call citizenship, of who belongs and on what terms. As it turns out, in each of these eras, there was some big controversy or issue that helped draw attention to and crystallize a debate about citizenship, about different ways of thinking about what it means to be Canadian. And as it turns out, the debate occurred in a political ecosystem that involved not just the local school, like Clinton, but the school board, the province, and in some cases, national institutions and imperatives as well. Take the 1970s and 80s. The question of belonging in Toronto schools came to a head from about the mid-70s to the mid-80s over the question of heritage language instruction. In 1971, Pierre Trudeau's government had declared multiculturalism an official government policy. And in short order, other institutions, like school boards, began to think through the implications of this new policy direction. The Toronto Board of Education, as it was then called, was of course particularly sensitive to the multicultural turn in policy because it was especially affected by the multicultural turn on the ground at schools like Clinton. The upshot is that the board commissioned a series of reports on multicultural programming, including and especially the place of language education in Toronto schools. Here's how the most important working group framed that challenge in 1975. And I quote, "This situation challenges the Board of Education for the City of Toronto to realize two fundamental goals. First, to provide equal educational opportunities to all children, and secondly, to do so without the loss of the child's personal identity and cultural integrity," end of quote. Note that the first goal is stated explicitly in the language of equality, in this case, the liberal language of equal opportunity. And the working group spent a lot of time explaining how it was incumbent on the board to invest more resources in such things as ESL to ensure that children who were recent immigrants and who arrived at school without English would not be at a disadvantage. But what of the second goal? To provide equal opportunities without the loss of the child's personal identity and cultural integrity. What did that mean? In terms of language policy, the basic point was pretty simple. Culture and language are inextricably connected. If schools embrace multiculturalism, doesn't it follow that they have to embrace multilingualism as well? And this is where multiculturalism and anti-racism linked arms for the progressive part of the school board and its employees, its staff. The board's final report on third language instruction, published in 1982, put the challenge this way. Again, to quote, "We support the process of revealing the many cultural identities and languages which make up our nation. Through realizing the potential of our many differences, we shall be richer than when we began," end of quote. Continues, The power of the creativity of human beings is our greatest potential. Our dialogue has convinced us that the real obstacles to realizing this potential are now, as they always have been, elitism and racism. Elitism and racism. Nor was this reference to racism an isolated example. The report of the 1975 Working Group on Multiculturalism, from which I quoted a minute ago, interwove discussions of the educational experiences of Greek Canadians and Chinese Canadians with those of the Black community. And their words about racism are strong. Quote, "For some time, trustees and staff of the board and the community have watched the specter of racism as though from a distance. But the victims of racism and the colonial foundations of history have known that it was there all along, badgering their lives and quietly eroding their private sense of worth and acceptability. Now, it no longer appears as though at a distance. It is here in full public view," end of quote. Indeed, in the view of the working group, and they say this explicitly, ethnocentrism and racism are essentially interchangeable, because in both cases, schools treated non-Anglo and non-white students as if they were invisible, their word, in a way that cut students off from their heritage, undermined their personal identity, and damaged their potential. I linger on these Board of Education studies from the 70s and 80s, both because they were among the first attempts to come to grips with the meaning of multiculturalism in education, and because they provide what may be the clearest snapshots of the connection between multiculturalism and equity. What exactly is that connection? The TBE studies really embrace two basic and related ideas. The first is cultural pluralism. That was actually momentous. The principles guiding Ontario education had last been articulated by the provincial ministry in 1937 as follows, quote, "The schools of Ontario exist for the purpose of preparing children to live in a democratic society that bases its life upon the Christian ideal." Christian actually meant Protestant, in fact, and given immigration restrictions and what we've just heard at the time, it is fair to include white and European on that list of privileged characteristics. To be a citizen in democratic Ontario, in other words, was to be white, European, and Protestant, which is to say that citizenship was defined in terms of a particular overriding and primary national, cultural, and racial tradition. The importance of the various TBE working groups that reported in the 70s and 80s then was that they explicitly repudiated that commitment. That is, they explicitly repudiated homogeneity or uniformity in favor of the idea that to be a citizen, you don't have to check your identity at the door. That was actually a pretty big deal and a pretty important step in the direction of equity. But cultural pluralism by itself is not enough. Yes, it's important to dismantle the idea that there is only one standard by which to measure membership. But multiculturalism cannot be reduced to the idea of live and let live, which is how multiculturalism is often interpreted today. No, the TBE working groups were clear that real multiculturalism requires that the state or government use its powers to resist uniformity. In their terms, to render what has been invisible visible, to recognize what has gone unrecognized, and that through this sort of muscular validation, schools are more likely to create real equality of opportunity for their students. That meant designing curriculum that is more inclusive, hiring staff that looks more like their students, and to return to the point of origin, finding ways in schools for cultural communities to preserve and enhance their heritage. Allowing cultural pluralism to flourish and actively or proactively accommodating these diverse cultural traditions, that was and is, I think, the connection between multiculturalism and equity. Is that enough to respond to structural racism? Probably not. Is it enough to respond to the challenges of indigeneity? Almost certainly not. But I think that recovering the original and bold understanding of multiculturalism is and ought to be a thing worth doing. Thanks very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Professor Vipond. We are going to be moving on to Professor James, and we will go, who is going to talk about multiculturalism a little further.
Thank you very much. About 12 years ago, some Swiss student teachers visited the Faculty of Education at York University, and they were doing things that were very similar to many other Europeans educators who have come to Toronto to visit, seeking to get some tips about teaching classes with culturally diverse student populations. This was consistent with the reputation that Toronto had developed about its success with multicultural education. The Swiss students were visiting at a time when the Toronto District School Board had just established the Afrocentric Alternative School, which was designed to meet the particular educational needs and interests of Black students, and in so doing, address the students' and parents' concerns about the poor school participation and educational performance of Black students. In reflecting on the Afrocentric approach to accommodating Black students, the Swiss students suggested that setting up an Afrocentric school would encourage, quote, segregation, exclusion, and discrimination, close. They argued that schools should, quote, mix students of different backgrounds so that they learn, quote, how to get along with each other so that their differences would not matter. They also stressed that teachers should, quote, encourage and perform all children in the same way, regardless of their differences, end of quote, since for them, in a multicultural society, students should not be separated, and they must be able to benefit from a multicultural society based on mutual adaptation and equal treatment. And they are convinced that this was made possible through what they call difference blindness. This was not unlike what the Ontario Premier and the Minister of Education argued at the time when the TDSB introduced the idea of establishing the Afrocentric Alternative School. So the concern was not how students could benefit from a teaching learning situation that would be culturally responsive to their learning needs, experiences, and interests, but to preserve the perceived difference blindness or color blindness of Canadian society. Never mind that the use of color to assert Canada's and Toronto's diversity, which is pronounced to be our strength. Sorry. We use, interestingly, I'm arguing here, we use color on our websites and to promote Canadianism. We use color to promote that diversity, but we do not use color in our multicultural connection. Indeed, Canada's multiculturalism is well admired by many around the world. When people in other parts of the world were asked about their perceptions of Canada and its place in the world, a common response includes descriptors such as friendly, warm, tolerant, democratic, and of course, multicultural. In fact, CBC, with the help of the International Council of Canadian Studies, asked some 7,000 Canadian studies teachers around the world and researchers of their own and their students' perceptions of Canada and its place in the world. Some of their responses were, and this comes from a Canadian studies teacher in Germany, says, Canada is a model for multifaceted immigration society with many different voices and multiple forms of cultural expression, including those of her Indigenous peoples. Another comment coming from Poland was, first and foremost, my students envision Canada as a country of immigrants, cherishing its multi-ethnic, multicultural, and multi-religious heritage. And another statement coming from Ireland said, one researcher there said, Canada could help post-conflict Northern Ireland move towards a better quality of life? We have learned from your policies on integration, immigrant settlement, and equality. We have been helped by many prominent Canadians. With such positive perceptions of Canada as a democratic multicultural country that welcomes immigrants, cherishes its diverse population, fosters equality, and values cultural differences, one would expect that we would have a schooling system that promotes its Indigenous, immigrant, and racialized young people, that provides its Indigenous, immigrant, and racialized young people with a culturally relevant and responsive education by which they would realize their aspirations and build on their interest. It would be logical to expect that the multicultural ethos and practices of Canada would enable racialized students to equitably participate in the educational processes, nurture their aspirations, and provide opportunities where they might be able to get that to which their parents had for them or have for them and they have for themselves. But given its colonial legacy, Canada's revered multiculturalism program and practices has been unable to sustain a schooling education program that has effectively served Indigenous, immigrant, and racialized students and their parents. And will not be able to do so without grappling with Canada's colonial project, which continues up until today. And one of the ways in which this colonial project continues and we see it experienced and presented to us is how the narrative of Canada never starts with Turtle Island and that of the colonialists, and that of the Indigenous peoples, but start with the colonialists. We don't hear of the Indigenous peoples, we don't know of their language, we don't know of their culture, we don't know of the governance structures, their ceremonies, or the relationships to the land. Despite having the land acknowledgement, there's no sense of those things in everyday language and everyday education. And that continues for me as the colonial project because we haven't changed it. The textbooks that, especially ones that become the main textbooks, do not start with Turtle Island, but continue with the colonialist history and that which we have inherited from them. So the perspectives of the colonizers continue even today. I'm reminded of Duncan Campbell Scott, Superintendent of Indian Affairs in 1993, when he said, and when he talked of the Indian problem, and he went on to say, our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there's no Indian question and no Indian department. And I would think that the multicultural policy and immigrants who have come in have exactly, that's the motto that continues, to absorb everyone into that Canadian project of colonial identity and to live in Canada as we would have them understand what Canada is. So the multicultural equity initiatives that today, that might be seen as ways in which we continue to encourage that which we think of encouraging the cultures of others, such as having Black History Month, Asian Heritage Month, Indigenous History Month, et cetera, or bringing racialized people to be speakers or even elders into the classroom and things like that. It's not necessarily to encourage and challenge the colonized project, but to just simply pacify the idea that, yes, we are multicultural and here's the where we're engaging people of different backgrounds. So Canadian multicultural education has proven to be incapable of achieving what it has promised. For example, in the 1970s and for decades since, studies of the educational experiences and achievements of Black youth have shown that compared to their white counterparts, Black and Indigenous students in the Toronto District School Board, the only board that at that time and up to a few years ago took data, so showed us that they were like Black students were likely to be at that time, I'm talking in the 70s, were more likely to be in basic education rather than in an advanced level of education. And therefore, they were not prepared at that time for education beyond high school, such as getting to university, but in most cases were able to go into jobs. Again, so you could see the implications of that whereas unemployment was concerned. Fast forward to the 2000s. The schooling situation for Black students remains the same. For example, in the Toronto District School Board, again, there's a 25% difference between Black students and their white and other racialized counterparts in terms of the number of them who are in academic programs. And as in earlier years, Black students are less likely to pursue post-secondary studies. Those who did more often chose to attend college. Black students also drop out of school and are suspended and expelled from school at higher rates than other students. Further analysis reveals that third-generation Black students, mostly of Caribbean origin, were most likely to be in an applied program, while first and second generation are more likely to be applied or essential. Sorry, first and second generation more likely to be in academic. So what do we need to do if we're going to change this colonial education system that has been unable to reach the racialized, Indigenous, and Black population? We have to embrace an educational vision that opposes colonization, anti-Blackness, and anti-indigeneity, and racism, and we should move towards a more decolonized education program. And I said program because it's not just simply the curriculum, but the entire education system must be addressed. We have to understand the limits of what the neoliberal settler colonial nation has handed down to us up to today. We have to recognize the necessity of advocacy and the advocacy work of Indigenous, Black, and other racialized communities in demanding and wanting change in an education system that's not serving them. We need to learn more about the ways in which these communities have been advocating on their behalf and have been supporting their children through the education system. And today, more so, because COVID-19 has not only added to the educational and social inequities, it has exacerbated the kinds of injustices that Black, racialized, and other students are dealing with in today's context. So going forward then, we need to reimagine education. And I think COVID-19 is giving us an opportunity to rethink. Probably we can think of this time that we pause, think seriously, and think of where do we go from here with education? And insofar that education is failing to pay attention to the lived experiences of students and the inequitable situation, we now therefore have a chance to think about how we might center the racialized experiences of students or the Indigenous experience of students in the curriculum, and to be able to think through how we might be more culturally relevant to the students and not erase differences, but understand how the differences will inform the kinds of expectations they have of education. Indeed, as Kojo once said, race is not merely a contributor, but in many cases, a major, if not sole determinant of the inadequate educational outcomes, as well as the emotional and mental well-being of racialized students. Hence, I would argue, it is important to have an education program in which all Canadians are able to learn what it means to be inclusive and equitable, as well as how we are influenced by the structures of inequity. We must all learn and understand that as long as equity programs are not accompanied by systemic changes that dismantle the structures of inequity, then we will go on to have inequitable educational opportunities and programs that fail to meet the needs and expectations and interests of students who are marginalized and look out for and need a better opportunities in our society. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor James. So we are moving finally on to Professor Mosby's conversation around the TRC and the history and future of Indigenous education.
Thanks so much. I'm just going to share my screen here. All right, is that working for everyone?
Yep, we can see.
All right. Oh no, it's not exact. Hold on a second. I just have to switch up my format. I didn't realize that when I shared my screen, I wouldn't be able to read my notes. All right. Sorry, everyone. So we started off our discussion today with Natasha's important reflections on the significance of 1965 and the closing of SS number 11. And so for my presentation, I want us to think of two other important historical moments that I think speak to many of the broader themes we've been talking about this evening. The first of these is 1996, when the last Indian residential school, the Gordon School in Saskatchewan, finally closed its doors. And the second is December 2015, when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada submitted its final report and completed its mandate. Now, the former date is important because it highlights just how recent the residential school era really was, in that it was within, I would argue, probably most of our lifetimes of the people who are watching this. But the latter date is also a reminder that it's now been 5 years since the completion of what I would argue was the largest and most important public history project ever undertaken in Canada. And it's really by looking at what we have and haven't learned in the aftermath of the TRC that we can start to understand the connections between the history and future of Indigenous education in Canada. Now, I attended a number of TRC events, and each time I was struck by just how massive an undertaking it was. Over the course of 7 national events with thousands of attendees, as well as during 238 days of local hearings in 77 communities across the country, the TRC collected nearly 7,000 statements from survivors, their families, and others directly affected by the schools. They also collected millions of pages of documents related to the schools, and which are now held at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation in Winnipeg. And finally, using these archival documents and the testimony from survivors, TRC commissioners produced 6 thick volumes of final reports and came up with a comprehensive list of 94 calls to action intended to address the ongoing legacy of residential schools in Canada. Now, as I always tell my students, it's always worth remembering that the TRC was not the product of a voluntary act of reckoning on the part of Canadians to make amends for the horrors of residential schools. In fact, it was created as part of a settlement agreement that emerged from what was at the time the largest class action lawsuit in Canadian history. Canada and its army of lawyers fought survivors every step of the way. And it was ultimately the survivors themselves who insisted that a Truth and Reconciliation Commission be held, with the funds for it coming out of the cash settlement with the Crown. So not out of some act of generosity on the part of the Canadian government. And in fact, the TRC was forced on a number of different occasions between 2010 and 2015 to force the government to produce a whole range of key documents essential to the Commission's work. They had to go to court to produce these documents. Now, when the TRC commissioners released an executive summary in June 2015, which described the residential school system as an attempted cultural genocide on the part of the Canadian government, Many Canadians expressed shock and disbelief. Well, I'd argue that residential schooling meets the legal definition for genocide under the 1948 UN Convention, and in fact, doesn't need the cultural qualifier used by the TRC in their final report. The substance of the Commission's findings are compelling and clear. Namely, that the system of racially segregated Indian residential schools established in Canada in the decades after Confederation and operated until 1996 was created with the specific goal of systematically destroying the languages, cultures, laws, governments, and basic family structures of Indigenous peoples in Canada. More than 6,000 children died in residential schools before the last one closed in 1996. But countless other lives were cut short after children returned to their communities traumatized and sick from the untold physical, sexual, and emotional abuse they experienced. My own work, for example, has helped to uncover not only a series of nutrition experiments conducted on nearly 1,000 malnourished children in 6 schools between 1948 and 1952, but also found that the hunger and malnutrition experienced by students at most schools prior to the 1960s likely led to serious long-term and even intergenerational health effects, including, for instance, elevated risks of obesity, diabetes, and other serious chronic long-term health conditions. Now, it's through this research, and particularly through my work with nutrition experiment survivors and their families, that I first became interested in tracking Canada's progress towards meeting the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action. The calls, which I would highly recommend reading if you haven't, offer a clear, quantifiable roadmap that Canada needs to follow in order to come to terms with the legacy of residential schooling. And so to this end, they address a range of issues that speak to the residential school system's complex intergenerational legacy. And they include, for instance, specific sections devoted to justice, child welfare, healthcare, and the education system. And I think importantly, there was, at least in 2015, a consensus among all political parties as well as the public that Canada needed to implement these 94 calls to action. I was actually there in person during the ceremony marking the release of the TRC's final report when the newly minted Prime Minister Justin Trudeau promised during a tearful speech before a room filled mostly with residential school survivors to complete every one of the 94 calls to action, starting with the implementation of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Now, it's been 5 years since the release of the TRC's final report, and there have indeed been some noticeable changes. My 7-year-old son, for instance, just recently came home to tell me that at school, his grade 2 class was reading the brilliant book When We Were Alone by David Robertson and Julie Flett. And as we learned from his teacher, they also spent the week leading up to Orange Shirt Day talking about the history of residential schools. Given that at 7 years old, this was already more than I learned about residential schools during my primary, secondary, and yes, even my undergraduate education, there's something to be said for this important cultural shift. But it's also worth noting that all of this was done on the initiative of his teacher, not as part of the broader curriculum. And in fact, during that same week on the other side of the country in Alberta, it was leaked that Jason Kenney's United Conservative Party government's new elementary school curriculum would leave out lessons about residential school in kindergarten to grade 4 because the topic is, quote, too sad for young children and would be better left until grade 9, where it could be taught alongside other examples of what they describe as, quote, harsh schooling. It's no wonder then that Canada has failed to make progress let alone complete call to action number 62, which directs all levels of government to develop and fund Indigenous content in education. Another recent headline similarly highlighted Canada's failure to implement another call to action number 14, which calls upon the federal government to enact meaningful and expansive Indigenous languages legislation. It began with this tweet. It began with this tweet from Melanie Joly, the Minister of Economic Development and Official Languages, celebrating the investment of more than $10 million into a French language school in Nunavut, quote, the most northern Francophone school in the world. The response from Inuit commentators was immediate. As Inuk filmmaker Alethea Arnacook-Baril wrote here, Hey, Inuit, you should be happy because you can be educated now in not one, but two colonial languages, but not Inuktitut, of course, despite the fact that the majority of our population in Nunavut speak Inuktitut as our first language. The reality, after all, is that there are currently no Inuktitut language immersion schools in the territory. And the most recent estimate for achieving even a bilingual education system in the territory is now 2039. And this, mind you, is in a territory where 65% of the Inuit population currently speaks Inuktitut as their mother tongue. To give you a sense then of how much has changed in Nunavut since the release of the TRC report. In 2015, the breakdown in language funding in the territory was approximately $4,000 per French language speaking person in Nunavut and only $40 per Inuit language speaker. In 2020, it's now $8,200 per Francophone speaker and $186 per Inuktitut speaker. As former Iqaluit Mayor Madeleine Redfern sums up the situation, imagine Nunavut Inuit children being able to go to school from K to 12 in Inuktitut. My daughter could not. Now it turns out that neither will my grandchildren. I should have added that it's now 4 generations in my Inuit family have never been given the opportunity to be educated in Inuktitut. 4 generations. Now I've gone over these recent examples in part because they speak to a broader pattern when it comes to Canada's response to the TRC's calls to action. I've been monitoring Canada's progress towards completing them since 2016. And as my Ryerson colleague Eva Jewell and I found last year in a report for the Yellowhead Institute, the overall progress has been abysmal. As of last December, Canada's completed 9 calls to action out of 94. And as we noted in our report, at this pace, Canada's on track to fulfill its promise to complete all 94 in roughly 2057. And while we're still in the process of completing our analysis for 2020, I can assure you that the progress has been minimal. And when you look at the calls to action related, for instance, to education, it becomes clear just how tragic this is. These, after all, are not radical proposals. In fact, I'd argue that the goal of these 7 calls to action is simply to get education for Indigenous kids up to the same level as their non-Indigenous counterparts. The fact that they've not been completed in 5 years means that Indigenous kids continue to face systemic racial discrimination when it comes to their education. Yet 5 years after the TRC's final report, 5 years after there was a virtual consensus that Canada would commit itself to a national project of reconciliation, even these basic demands for equity have apparently been a bridge too far for Canadians and our elected leaders. And when you then put these calls to action related to Indigenous education in the context of Canada's failures to meet the other calls to action, aimed at addressing the systemic anti-Indigenous racism at the heart of Canada's child welfare, justice, and healthcare systems, you're left with some tough questions. What do we, as historians, as educators, as citizens, what do we do when faced with the reality that even the largest public history project ever undertaken in Canada, a project which convincingly describes a genocidal education system almost as old as the country itself, what do we do when even the findings of the TRC prove to be insufficient motivation towards meaningful change, even after all the tearful promises of reconciliation? I think this is a good question to leave you all with tonight. So I want to thank you and in particular my fellow panelists for being here.
Thank you so much, Professor Mosby. And I gotta say a huge shout out to all of our panel speakers. You all kept to time. I didn't even have to send over harsh responses to remind you all that that you should all finish. So thank you so much. So now we're going to open up the floor for a really engaging question and answer period. We have about 25 minutes or so to continue some of this conversation. And some people have already sent over some questions. And the first one is put almost like a question, but I hope I can anticipate some of them. The first one is to say that if it wasn't for the persistence of parents, I can sadly imagine that the end of segregated schools in Ontario would have happened much later, and looking at residential schools decades later. So I think the audience member is likely asking a question about the role of parents and community members in really thinking through education and the way that segregated schooling affected particularly Black and Indigenous communities. So I think that question is open to all panel speakers. So if anyone is interested in kind of tackling that first, the floor is yours.
Okay, Ian's smiling. Okay, I'll go briefly. I'll try to go quickly. So absolutely, I would say that, you know, those who were in power, you know, white dominant society, and leaders in education, um, they instituted and upheld these practices, and these different views of public education or the purpose of education for different groups. And when we look, for example, at Egerton Ryerson, and looking at his legacy, look at, right, how ideas of race under his leadership shaped and led to residential schools in Ontario, led to racially segregated schools for Black children. And so these ideas would have, without the advocacy of parents and their determination and their insistence, would have gone on in the form that it was for much longer. But then we could also talk about what are the continuities that we see today? How is that morphed in different ways today? You know, and I think many of us had talked on the panel, had talked about, you know, some of the repercussions and the legacies of that. And so while it may not be politically correct to have a school today and explicitly say that it's, you know, it's solely for these students for whatever reason, how do we see that playing out in other ways in terms of the decisions and the policies that are upheld? How do we see that in the sense that particular programs that are absent of particular racialized bodies are held up as prestigious and exclusive, but then in school spaces where you have larger number of more racialized students, that they're viewed in much different ways. So absolutely, I would, the advocacy of parents have always changed the tide in terms of, you know, make effective change, because as you know, just back to my opening, that those in power had exercised that power to maintain the status quo and to produce unequal outcomes, whether it's to produce a particular, to produce a labor force to serve, you know, in different roles or whatnot. And without that advocacy of parents, we would see, you know, we would see those practices continue for quite a long time.
Any other panel speakers like to respond to that question about the role of parents in advocacy, or at least changing and shifting the tide of segregated education in Ontario?
Well, I'll just add, in the case of residential schools, the entire time parents were fighting and advocating for their kids, and it, you know, the abandonment of the residential school model by the government very much had to do with advocacy on the part of Indigenous communities and parents. But it's also worth remembering that the state made it illegal to withhold your children from residential schools for much of the 20th century, and parents were faced the threat of going to jail or sending their kids off to these schools that they knew were harmful. And so they were given a lot of false choices, and there's limits to advocacy in a white supremacist state. And it's really important to recognize that.
All right, thank you. And as an extension of that, I had another question around, can any of the panelists speak to how parents might be able to advocate and teach about these histories now, today? So as an extension, what are some of the things that parents can do today?
Obviously, I think parents can insist about changes in the curriculum. I think it's one thing for parents to do these things, but at the same time, we need also the policymakers and people who are responsible for ensuring that we have these materials in schools are there. And so it's not going to be just parental effort. It's going to mean parents, policymakers. It also means historians. Historians are going to have to start rethinking how we're going to present the history that must be, and I know I'm talking to historians here, but you guys have a responsibility here. Of course, I'm not saying that other disciplines should not, but you need to give the other people in these other disciplines the kinds of information that we also need to incorporate. We just can't, history cannot be seen as just then, because what happens today is informed by that historical account. And therefore, it's going to be not just parents, as I said earlier, but everyone's going to have to be, this has to be not only a whole school and a whole province thing, this is going to have to be a whole society thing, or else it's going to be it's going to be piecemeal. Because if the structures remain the same, if the colonial project continues, what good is the parent effort without changing that as well?
All right, thanks, Carl, and that low-key shade. Thank you to historians. And there's another question in the chat that says, how do we then work with governments to facilitate change? This person says that I worked on Canada's multicultural heritage course in the late 1970s and 80s, but the new provincial government, Liberal government, removed the course with very little protest. And it is true that Indigenous history, identity, and culture were mostly absent from this course mentioned. So the question is, how might we work then with governments to ensure that some of these kind of programs are better equipped to deal with conversations around multiculturalism? So I wonder if, Rob, we might have you start to answer that particular question.
Right, so this is, in fact, I think, part of what I consider to be a bit of a sad story, that after that high moment of excitement about multiculturalism, there has been a real erosion in terms of curriculum, in terms of the other sorts of initiatives. I guess, I mean, I teach a lot of students who want to work in government. So I guess I have a slight bias towards thinking that providing them with the tools, with the knowledge, with the breadth of understanding of what is involved, of the importance of that sort of curriculum throughout the system, is not a bad way to start. I mean, in the 70s and 80s. One of the things that really drove the progressive education movement in Toronto was the appearance of a whole group of pretty feisty recent graduates from university who were hep on changing things, who were in key staff positions, people like Dan Leckie, who ran for the Board of Education, was successful. And that became a really important force. And I maybe I'm too optimistic, but I continue to think that if one could get the same sort of enthusiasm, the same sort of mobilization, working through from universities to policymakers, people running for election and so on and so forth, that could be a dynamic force again. As I say, maybe I'm being Pollyannish about it, but I do think that really was the story of the 70s and 80s, in that moment of real progressivism on the Toronto Board of Education.
To add a pessimistic note, I talked about the Jason Kenney and the UCP's the leaked curriculum document about not teaching residential schools because it's too sad. Part of that leaked curriculum document also had the quote, "Equity is probably a politically partisan and charged buzzword." and they should remove equity from the goals of the curriculum and education. So, you know, we're in a time, you know, in terms of what happened in Ontario, there was a leading the charge on reforming the Indigenous curriculum was a whole number of Indigenous scholars and elders and academics, and that was canceled at the very last minute by the Ford government. And so we didn't see these possibilities being realized. And so it is a fight, and it's a political fight. And there's a lot of, you know, the rise of conservative governments in nearly every province. And this is something that they're fighting against, is what we're talking about today, of actually bringing these histories into the classroom and really talking about real equity. So, yeah.
Maybe could I just add one other thing, which is specifically on the question of multiculturalism. I think that there is, within the, you know, the overall narrative structure, if you like, of Canada, there is a sort of secret weapon that people who want to move the multicultural initiative and agenda forward haven't really used, and that is Section 27 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which says that this charter shall be, not maybe, but shall be interpreted in a way that is consistent with the preservation and enhancement of Canada's multicultural heritage. And it seems to me that that's a pretty clear signal to all that fall under it, which means policymakers in education, means to individual schools and so on and so forth, that they not only have the right to start talking about these issues, but actually an obligation. It shall be. And I don't understand. I mean, I understand that courts don't like that particular provision of the charter because it doesn't really provide guidance. But it does seem to me that it has tremendous potential for us to say, you know what, there is a standard, and it's not backsliding to something that was earlier. It's actually to preserve and enhance, and that provides a green light for the sort of curricular initiatives that ought to be occurring, and a red light to what's going on in Alberta, as Ian has said. That those symbolic statements actually can have real effect and power when used well.
Thank you so much. So we have quite a few questions around providing guidance into what people can do to implement or create kind of more equitable policies in kind of individual schools. So I'll ask this question because I think it encompasses several, but one of them asks you to consider how you can integrate TRC recommendations with Indigenous students with disability. So this intersection between indigeneity and disability. And I think that one will likely be for you, Ian. But as an extension of that conversation, another question is actually asking, what needs to happen in order to create sustained political advocacy that will create systems of education that are affirming for Black and Indigenous students, and I would say broadly racialized students in Ontario schools?
So yeah, I'll start with, I guess, the question about the TRC, and you know, and there are I think one of the challenges is, because curriculum is set at a provincial level, there are limits to what individual school boards can do, but they're, you know, I think parents advocating for, you know, contacting their local trustees, contacting their principal, contacting their children's teachers, and asking them what they're doing to implement these calls to action, ask them what they're doing to implement Indigenous education in their schools, has some power. And I think the same is true of talking about the history, talking about Black history, and talking about introducing Black history to you know, their kids. It's the same thing. There are those fights that you can do and the kind of advocacy you can do, but once again, you know, there are limits to that, and there needs to be real shifts in curriculum. And a lot of the calls to action, one of the reasons why they haven't been implemented is because it does need these bigger policy decisions to happen on the federal and provincial levels. And it's really difficult to make those substantive changes.
Could you read the second question again?
Yes, so the second question is, what needs to happen in order to create a sustained political advocacy to create systems of education that are life-affirming for Black and Indigenous students?
I think it's interesting that within the last few months with COVID, the murder of Floyd, we have been talking about anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism. We've been talking about systemic racism. And yes, indeed, governments have been admitting that racism is systemic in our society. But I'm not quite sure, beyond just saying these things, what do we really mean by them and how are we really addressing them in terms of the action? And if I would think if we were indeed a society in which we understood differences and paid attention to differences, then the racism that we have been experiencing and the difficulty that people have been having to admit and recognize how racism is operating, then would be something that we would have addressed even before now. So this idea of us moving our society and our education program, etc., it's not just to simply say, yes, systemic racism exists, but what are we going to do about it and how do we understand it exists? And I think that whole other question of how do we understand its existence, beyond just simply saying, beyond just simply these individual relations, but thinking of it in systemic ways. That's the challenge I think we have. And that's the important thing. So how do we understand it as structural? And not just simply something that we just going to, yeah, I admit that I am racist and therefore I move on. No, we need to go beyond these individual pronouncements to think about the structure changes. Otherwise, we're going to maintain. And multiculturalism cannot continue to be a cloak that hides the fact that we need, that racism and systemic racism exist. And we have not dealt with it in Canada and continue not to be dealing with it unless we do something differently.
I'll jump in here as well. In terms of that political advocacy, there are many components to that. So Ian talked about the curriculum, and that is under the purview of the state. There is not one specific learning expectation that all students in Ontario have to learn about a 400-year Black presence in Canada, despite the fact that this has been advocated for, extensively over years, right, over a couple of generations. And so while the newer curriculum has some optional topics, they are just that, there are options. And so it requires a response and an intervention from the state in order to remedy that, because it is in of itself one of the ways that public education shows its anti-Black racist self, is that this refusal to address that. And then even more broadly, as Ian talks about, right, how did the holdup of some of the curriculum pieces around Indigenous histories and experiences coming out of the TRC, the resources, the training, the support, when the government pulled that funding, that says something. And so that the political advocacy then comes from broader communities in terms of letting your voices be heard, in terms of also, using your vote, so to speak. And another element of that as well is engaging in that political process and being the political representatives that we need to have and should have that helps to push some of these changes at the school board level and at the state level. So that could include, for example, you know, people running for school trustees and whatnot, to have to be in parts of these spaces, these decision-making spaces that impact, right, large swaths of students in school boards. So there's that. And then there's, you know, the continuation of this grassroots organizations that have been going on, you know, forever in terms of pushing for change. So I think it comes from a lot of different directions.
Thank you. So we have a couple more minutes for a few questions. So if anyone has any burning questions, please feel free to drop it in the chat. Another question that actually someone has asked is directed more specifically to you, Natasha, and it really revolves around how most Canadians are taught about segregation and inequality in education, largely through an American lens. And so are there any parallel experiences or unique Black Canadian experiences that might be able to help us understand how we can begin to tackle systemic inequality in the Canadian context?
There are many experiences. As I kind of outlined, we have already over a 100-year history of that. But as Carl said, it's not something that is part of the common knowledge of Canadians. That, you know, we often have this ideal vision of public education as this great equalizer, open to all, and you just have to engage it, and you know, everything will be okay. And so that has not been challenged or turned upon its head in any large measure. And so there's that. And there are people who have done a lot of work documenting this history. You know, I know, Funké, I'm looking forward to your book again from the teacher perspective. Sylvia Hamilton has a documentary that I recommend and that I use as part of professional learning, The Little Black Schoolhouse, that looks at the history of racially segregated schools in Ontario. There are interviews, you know, there are many interviews. For example, I was just on the TRC website again a couple of days ago. There were many interviews from people who were once students in the system, where we could hear from them and begin to develop an appreciation and a real understanding of their experiences. So there are many resources that we can go to. But as Carl said, it needs to be more widely available and become more part of the common discourse that we undertake as we, you know, as we grapple with the realities of a colonial state.
But one important question for me when that question is posed, I say, how is it that we know these narratives from the US, then we know the narratives of the Canadian context? Mm-hmm. How is it that the people would have gone through years of education in our public education system, university, and that narrative continue? There's something about what we're not doing, or how is it that we know more about race and racism and the situation of Black or Indigenous people in the American context than we know of the Canadian context?
I would say that is also part of the Canadian historical narrative, this idea of Canadian benevolence and this Canadian moral superiority, that in and of itself is woven into and part of a particular Canadian narrative, right? To present Canada in this particular light in juxtaposition to the US.
So the point is then that in that case, we should use this opportunity to start thinking of the questions we ask and what motivates those questions. How is it that in 2020, we're asking those questions of ourselves? Are we not able to answer those questions in the Canadian context? And so how is it our culture continue to perpetuate these, okay, let's hear about those other people first, because we don't have similar situations here?
Really important questions. I think as a final roundup question that I'll ask each panelist is, several people continue to ask this question, and that is, what is the most effective approach to developing anti-racist policy in educational settings? And this question really asks us to think through the structural and systemic changes that are necessary and needed for that. So let's start with Rob, and then maybe we'll move to Ian and Natasha and Carl to wrap us up.
I think in the first place, one, and I hope that this has come out this evening, is one has to have a clear-headed view of what actually happened, as opposed to what we think happened or would want to have happened. But I think as well, one way to approach it is to understand that and I think this is true of both multiculturalism and anti-racism and the Indigenous question as well, which is that we're all involved in a sort of attempt to figure out whether we cross boundaries, whether we protect boundaries, or whether we blur boundaries. And we have to figure out better ways to understand when one wants to cross boundaries, protect boundaries, and blur them in a way that makes it possible for our kids to really flourish and to realize their potential.
I'll come back to, recommending that everyone actually just read and regularly read the TRC calls to action. Like I said, it's a really clear description of what needs to be done. And that's just to get Indigenous kids to a level of equality. When we want to talk about equity, we need to talk about going beyond that. But I also want to speak for myself as a historian who works on the history of residential schools, is to realize that it's not enough just to do the research. There are political solutions to these problems. You need to be political about the way you approach it, right? One of the reasons why I got involved with tracking the calls to action is because it's literally the least I can do, is try to make sure that Canada lives up to its obligations. And so we need to think of ourselves as well, of using our power as historians, as scholars, as educators, and use that political power in whatever way we can. And it's different for everyone. But I think that's a really big part of the solution, is not being cloistered in the quote unquote ivory tower, but actually putting our work to political work.
Natasha.
Repeat the question again. I just want to make sure.
Yeah, it was offering suggestions of how we can, or what are the most effective approaches to developing anti-racist policies within educational settings.
Mm-hmm. Well, these policies, as Ian talked about, the higher they come from in the system through these political decisions, the stronger they will be. And so that, comes from the Ministry of Education, in particular school boards, then coming up with policies, trustees, then also on the operational side, looking at these, the operations part of it as well. But again, oftentimes these changes will come because parents and community have been pushing for change. So then that also calls for thinking about these processes in terms of how we come to address that, and school boards working in partnership with parents and communities and listening to them and not viewing them as, as people who just want to disrupt things, or who are out, who are out to get them. When parents are out here spending a lot of time and a lot of hours because they want change, they want better for their children, they want their children to thrive and be in positive learning environments. And so that also requires collaboration and partnership. So thinking about those power dynamics as well in relation to making some of these changes.
I see that it's not only individual, but it must be also a collective effort, and must be structural effort. Constantly seeing that all these are interrelated, and therefore that's the only way that we're going to go forward. And as Ian was saying, we have to see that it's also political. It just can't be just social. It has to be political, and so therefore we must make such efforts in terms of addressing the political angle of things, talking to politicians, engaging governments, engaging school boards in the many ways we're expected. So it's going to take that, all that we can, and not just, it cannot be just individual way in going towards these things. And and we must admit that race is one of those things that as Canadians, we're not comfortable talking about. And we try to put that aside. And we're going to have to talk race and talk about racism as one of the barriers to the kinds of effective development of our society.
All right, thank you so much to our panel speakers. We have quickly run out of time in what is and continues to be an engaging conversation. And a question popped up in the chat, but we are over time, but I'll leave it to the panel and participants to maybe think about later. And that question is to say, can schools even be reformed? Schooling in Canada has been designed and has been meant to segregate, stream, and privilege certain groups of people. What might it look like if we just burned the entire system to the ground? What could we imagine instead of school? So we'll leave it there for all of you all to think about. And I just wanted to remind audience members that if you are interested in registering for our upcoming sessions, this is the first of 4 different sessions, including one that's happening on November 24th, entitled, Are We Moving Closer to Gender Equity in Education? Featuring Kathleen Wynne, the former Premier of Ontario. So for any of you who are interested, you are more than welcome to register for these upcoming events at EnochTurnerSchoolhouse.ca. And you can also feel free to donate to this nonprofit organization that is bringing you all these wonderful speakers today. So thank you so much for sharing your brilliance and your time, panel speakers. Thank you all to everyone who has attended today. We really appreciate you joining in on the conversation.
Thanks very much for having
us.
Have a good night.
Thanks to the other panelists for this opportunity.
Yeah. Great panel. Thank you, everyone.
And you're getting lots of praise in the chat. I don't know if you all can see it, but they're sending it to me. So you're getting lots of positive vibes.
Thanks, Funké. All right, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Good night.